Hello everybody, I'm Colin D. Ellis and welcome to the Culture and Coffee podcast, where every episode I discuss a new topic of workplace culture and provide some insights and some practical things for you to do. Don't forget to like, subscribe and to share with people who you may think would be interested. Okay, let's get on with today's episode. Hello everybody, it's Colin here. Welcome to another episode of the Culture and Coffee podcast. Coffee today is from Grind, who hand roast in London. I'm in Shoreditch in London, which is East London? No, it's not. It's North London. Yeah, Shoreditch is North London. And there's a place just around the corner, so I picked up some beans from there and they kindly ground them for us. And so that's what I'm drinking today. Okay, today's session is on repeating mistakes. Now, repeating mistakes is the fastest way to failure, which sounds like a really obvious thing to say, but it's true. And yet many organizations fall into the trap of doing it over and over again. Now, for those of you who've been listening to the podcast for a while, and those of you who know a little bit about me, been stalking me, which is fine. I cut my teeth, certainly in management, working in projects. And there's no profession that repeats mistakes like projects. I think the statistics are alarming. It's like $1 million is wasted for every 10 million spent. That's a lot of money. 11% of business investment is wasted to poor project performance. I think only 4% of projects ever realize the benefits. But it's not just projects. And when I was researching for DETOX Your Culture, there were a number of consistent themes that kept coming up. And so, specific examples include things like Boeing. So Boeing's a great example of an organization currently has a toxic culture, and it just repeated mistakes. So it faced, it had design flaws in its 737 MAX aircraft. Now, they had a fatal crash in 2018. But what they didn't do was kind of ground the fleet at that stage. When they had the fatal crash in 2018, they didn't address the underlying issues, even though they knew what they were. And they still put the planes out. They're like, nah, it'll be fine. She'll be fine. I mean, obviously, I'm sure they didn't. I'd like to think they didn't say that. And then there was another fatal crash in 2019. Not only that, they've had 2 more incidents since then. And they're just in this toxic tornado, which is something I talk about in the book. Wells Fargo in 2016, another case study that I talked about in the book, they created millions of fraudulent savings and checking accounts on behalf of their clients without their consent. And then said, okay, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're going to stop doing that. But then they found to do it again in 2022. And so these are the mistakes that organizations have repeated. But I think what I see on a more granular level, and this is what you might see too, things like failing to give managers the skills to actually manage. I think most organizations will have an underperforming manager, and the root cause of that is they just don't know how to manage. But what they never do is go, what we need here is we need a basic management program. That's what we need, where we can teach them how to set expectations really clearly and communicate and all of these kinds of things, right? Another mistake that people make all of the time is using technology unproductively, particularly emails and meetings and just tying themselves into knots. I was asked to comment on AI recently, and someone said, oh, AI is going to dramatically change cultures. I'm like, man, not for a while. because people still don't know how to use email. It's absolutely crazy. And so AI has the capacity to do it, but oh man, just you think about your own organization, the way you use technology, like you've been doing it for years. Like why have you been doing it for years? I think that the 2 big things though, and this is where it leads to consistent failure, is walking past poor behavior or tolerating poor performance. So poor behavior, as soon as you walk past it, right, that becomes the default behavior for the team, for the organization. And it's really bad. And something that I always talk about, as soon as you spot poor behavior, you have to deal with it immediately. Otherwise, what happens is it becomes pervasive within the organization. Everybody copies everybody else. Now, particularly if it's a leadership behavior, and there are so many stories of toxic cultures where the leader behaved in a particular way, and then everybody else thought that they could do it too, or they were afraid to challenge it, which is quite often the case. Particularly if the leader's a narcissist or a sociopath, right? No one wants to go near that. But and I've talked about in the book, and I've talked about in the past how it's really HR's responsibility to be the moral compass for the organization and make sure that people don't behave in a way that undermines the safety within the culture. And yet it happens time and again. And then what happens is it passes it down. As someone who worked in a toxic culture myself in New Zealand government, it just takes one leader at the top to behave in a particular way, and then other people think that they can copy it, and it just sort of seeps down. So that's a mistake. Is not actually addressing that. And then poor performance is we've just got this assumption, much like with poor behavior, where we just expect people will change. We'll have a word with them, and we just think that they'll change, and then they won't. It's the same with poor performance. Is we say, okay, well, you need to do something different this time. They go, okay, yeah, I will. And then they don't. And then we just tolerate it. And, that becomes you're only as good as your poorest performing employee. So really, as a culture, what you've got to do is make sure that collectively you're addressing this. And you see this in sports all the time in high performing teams, is when one player is letting the side down, then the other players are on at them. Doesn't matter what sport it is. The other players are on at them, in an encouraging, motivational way to begin with. But if they keep letting the side down, then they get pulled off the pitch. Then the manager of whatever team it is or the head coach will pull them off the pitch, because what you can't afford to do is keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Now, sometimes it's just having a bad day at the office, and that's absolutely fine, right? No one can be perfect all of the time. But if they're repeating the same mistakes and performing poorly all of the time, same if they're behaving badly all of the time, then really what you've got to do is drop them or move them on or find something else that they're more suited to do. But I thought it would be useful, in analysing all of the mistakes and analysing all of the case studies, to kind of give you a sense. For me, there are three consistent themes, because I could spend another 15 minutes just relaying all the mistakes, but all I've got to do is get you nodding, going, "Yep, do that. Yeah, we do that. We do that. We do that." So what I wanted to do is give you the three themes and really get you thinking about in this session what you can do differently, or things you can maybe change, or things that you need to think about, maybe have the courage to address. So there are three definite themes. Okay. So the first theme is poor communication. Now, this starts with actually writing down the mistake that you made, right, or the individual made. So whenever anything broke, now this is something we used to do in the project world, and I think many people still do, is they have, kind of a bit of a lessons learned. But too often it was a post-mortem. The thing broke or died, and oh my gosh, we've got to write it all down, rather than what are you noticing along the way? What are you talking about? What are you bringing to the fore? What are you sharing with others? And so documenting those through issues and immediately bringing them to light is a really good thing to do. One of the things that I've worked with a number of teams on is we created a failure wall. And again, it wasn't about finger pointing. It was more about what's the thing that we can document and communicate so no one else makes the same mistake, within a week. Like I said, too often we get to the post-mortem, and I'll come to the post-mortems in a minute. So kind of documenting those lessons and communicating them as they arise is really, really useful, because it sends a bit of a warning signal to sort of say, listen, we're not very good at this, so we should change this. And let other people know, here's one thing that we did that you shouldn't do. The second thing when it comes to communication is a real lack of clarity. We don't actually take the time to set expectations really clearly, or else what we don't do is make them clear enough, or kind of ask for feedback, ask for questions. And clarity is important, because what we see within our workplaces, if a concept and an idea is easy to understand, it's easy to implement. But often it takes a little bit more effort to generate that simplicity, right? Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It's something that Da Vinci said, and he's absolutely right. My old mate Leonardo da Vinci, he's absolutely right. It is the ultimate sophistication, but simplicity is hard to do. But actually, when you provide that clarity, it makes something easier to communicate, easier to understand. And then the last element of poor communication, and something that I've seen, is all around feedback, is that we're not very good at providing feedback in the moment. We think it's somehow, I don't know, damaging to an individual if we, let them know that they did something that they shouldn't have done, said something that they shouldn't have done, or went about, a job in a way that, generated poor results. But it's not. In fact, it's the kindest thing to do is to provide feedback, providing it's empathetic and compassionate. It's the kindest thing to do to let somebody know at that time, or in the moment, listen, here's what I observed, here's what you did, here's one thing that you can think about, here's one thing that you can do differently. And, and as you'll see as we go through this is all part of this basic management toolkit. Which is something that I do, and people are like, well, I've never been taught how to give feedback. Yeah, of course you haven't. But this is something that you had to pick up along the way. But actually, when you're taught how to give feedback really well, really enhances communication. So poor communication is the first of the three key themes that I see in consistent failure. The second one is inadequate planning. Now, this also includes risk management, inadequate planning. And so, what good risk management does is it looks at, we're talking about the culture, but it's also applicable to projects if you're into projects. It looks at the initiative that you're undertaking. It looks at the culture, and it says, listen, what could go wrong here? We call these pre-mortems, right? We don't want to get to the point where the patient's died and we're, having to pore over the body and analyze what went wrong. A pre-mortem is, what could go wrong here, but also what could we get right? And there's not enough of this that happens in cultures. So whenever I start working with a new organization, we'll spend a period of time with a core group of people from across the organization and just analyzing it and say, okay, well, listen, we're about to start this refresh process. Remember, cultures don't change, they evolve. What could go well? What could go badly? So that pre-mortem is a bit of a signal. It's an early risk management. But the post-mortem is also important, because I think what you want to do is actually plan in specific review points along the way to make sure that you're capturing the lessons such that you can communicate them, with the linkage between communication and risk management there. And this is where you get that transparency, is here's something that we found, now let's communicate it. And so the post-mortems have got real structure to them, and they're not about blame. I'll come back to blame in a second, because often it's inherent within cultures. But what you want to really do is kind of really get that sense of, well, what happened? Why did it happen? What was the root cause? What can we do differently? How do we enhance the learning? Now, a big part of planning is actually ensuring that managers have got the skills to be able to do what you need them to do on a daily basis. And if they don't have the skills, it leads to consistent failure. I've gone on record in the past, and many organizations will invest a silly amount of money in a leadership program that doesn't actually deliver any tangible benefit, when actually they get way more from putting their managers through a basic management training program. Okay, where they then, and then plan that in every year. I work with a couple of organizations. Every year I go back and do the management program every year. My programs, I keep updated. So it's always relevant, it's always fresh content, never the same thing over and over again. And we measure it, right? And that's part of that real strong, good planning to make sure that we're not repeating the mistakes. So poor communication is the first theme. Second theme is inadequate planning. And the third theme is just having a resistant culture. So resistant culture is the third theme. And so a resistant culture, often there's blame. I think people enjoy blaming people sometimes. You know what I mean? I think people like pointing the finger. Well, it wasn't me, it was him. He's to blame. She's to blame. She did that, not me. They did that, wasn't me. And so it's easier to do that rather than say, okay, well, let's set back, let's analyze. What did we do? How did we do it? What can we learn? What can we change? How do we factor that in? Is the planning piece into our management programs? And then how do we communicate it? There's that communication piece. And so kind of you have to look at what's inherent within your culture. So yes, there's blame, but there could also be a fear of owning up to mistakes. Now, sometimes that's an individual trait, but also sometimes that's, people just don't feel safe to raise these things. And often I saw that time and time again in some of the culture surveys that I read, that there was just no mechanism to provide the feedback, or people were very good at blowing the whistle because there was a kind of a channel to do that, but nothing was done with it. And that's that resistant culture to kind of go, we're listening, but we're not really, is that they wanted to change only the things that they actually wanted to change. But when it was something difficult, they didn't. And I think I spoke about on the podcast last year, I was approached by an organization and they wanted to change their culture. But one of the key issues was the behavior of one of the most senior people. And as we started to work, I read all of the engagement survey feedback, and I said, we nothing's going to change unless you deal with this individual. And they just didn't want to do it. So we kind of did an initial piece of investigation work, and I said, I'd just be stealing your money here, right? Consultant with integrity. There you go. Who knew that existed? But I'd just be stealing. Nothing's going to change. We could do an elaborate program. We could make it, and we could inspire the heck out of people, and they would love it. But nothing would change. But there's a real example of where the culture was just resistant to actually addressing that. People called it elephant in the room. I was like, let's just call it what it is: bad behavior of a senior leader. I think the other thing with regard to a resistant culture, we're seeing this a lot right now, is decision paralysis. There are many organizations right now who've maybe shifted to a more hybrid working, they would call it hybrid working culture, greater flexibility, who just need to work on their cultures. The culture just is not where it needs to be. And they know they have to spend time, money, and effort to actually address it, but they just won't make the call. Instead, it's easy to spend money on traditional things that they've always spent money on in the hope that it will turn around. But either the culture's too nice, it's too pleasant, we're not getting things done, or it's just too combatant and everyone's kind of at each other's throats, or, there's lots and lots of passive aggressive behavior. And most senior leaders will think the answer to that is, let's just drag everyone back to the office, rather than actually making the better decision, which is to, kind of positively involve the staff in a new process to positively evolve the culture. And so, kind of when you look at those themes, poor communication, inadequate planning, resistant culture, these are the things that consistently, if you don't address them, they will lead to failure. time and time again. And you know, one mistake will never really harm the business, never really harm the team, but the same mistake over and over again absolutely will. It will undermine the integrity, it will undermine performance, it will undermine future potential. It will undermine the ability to attract the kind of people, because you'll develop a reputation of repeating the same mistakes over and over again, over and over again. And you know, this is not about trying to create some kind of failure averse culture. That's just not possible. But it's about creating some resilience and some internal learning to ensure that you don't make the same mistake over and over again, such that you're continually evolving in a positive way. In a way, you're making different mistakes in order to you know, kind of build in that resilience and get to the point where you're really good at what you do. You're really good at learning. Your managers have got the skill set, and there is actually true leadership, and you never find yourself in the media like others have for making the same mistake over again. All right, that's your session for today. Hope you've enjoyed the podcast. Ta-ra for now.
Thanks for listening to today's podcast. If you'd like to find out more about how I can help you transform the culture of your team, head to my website at www.colindellis.com.